Right.
And that's hectic, but we've all learned a lot about remote work over the course of this pandemic. So a lot more people are more comfortable working that way. And I've been doing that, since time anyway. So let's make some gold records,
Yeah, dope, man. So tell me a little bit about these. First of all, thanks for sharing your story. It's like, I don't know. I've been thinking about it. I wanted to get the full picture from you, actually. So I'm happy you shared it on the podcast, because I'm just like watching this happen on Instagram. I'm like, dude, what is this? What is this story? This is like the most interesting thing I've ever seen.
I'm glad you feel that way. And I mean, it's a music production podcast, so I fear that once again we have veered tangentially away from the topic at hand.
That's okay. Well, my podcast is I feel like it's going in a more philosophical direction these days. I don't know. I feel like it varies. I mean, obviously it centers around music and production and what we do, but like it's interesting like to see a podcast evolve over time, because I feel like when I first started this podcast, I was like, okay, I have these kind of questions laid out, and I wrote them out, and I would ask people the questions. Okay, got you answer that one next one. And eventually I figured out how to have a conversation with people, and now it's kind of like, okay, cool, let's just see where it goes, and it's much more organic. I don't know, it's kind of like evolved over time.
I've experienced something similar, because you start off, maybe the first few episodes you talk to people that because that's your first few guests, right? And then as you sort of branch off and start talking to people that you've never really spoken to before at all, like you move from talking to people to talking to people you've met but don't know, to then talking to straight up like fresh new people. And there's the idea of having a conversational podcast, and then there's the like interview style questions, right? And I struggle with that sometimes too, because it's like I use the interview style questions as a backup, and like I try to lean on the flow of the conversation first and foremost. And if that goes, and I have lots of leeway with my podcast, because it's not really about anything in particular. It's about the guest at that particular time. And so
it's just an interesting conversation. That's all. All it is.
It totally. It's that model of a podcast. And so you want to allow the conversation to go and flow. And if it's sort of not doing that, if the conversation hits a roadblock, or if that person is just not very talkative, or something, then you kind of have those interview questions as the fallback. That's kind of how I try to approach it, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of leaning into that camp now as well. Mm-hmm. I do. There are like obviously like questions that I always try to get to.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, like on a podcast. But now I'm like really very open to seeing where it goes, because I feel like I've talked about so many techniques already, and so many theories and approaches, and so like sometimes I'll get like something. I'll get something interesting in every episode, but like sometimes it's just more interesting to kind of see what this person's about and what they're dealing with or thinking about, and so I'm down for all of it now.
And you've done so many episodes, so you have like covered so much ground, and what you're saying, it reminds me of like if anybody's tried to learn mastering on their own, what they'll find is that all the literature out there is just like, especially before the era of YouTube tutorials, even though those can be quite nefarious as well. And great ones as well. But before that era, if you were trying to learn about mastering and maybe you wanted to find a book about it to read, right? Some textbook, it would just be the worst, right? Like always, like it would just tell you nothing.
Yeah.
Like you would read the book and you're like, mastering is defined as the art of adjusting parameters such that makes the thing sound better. And you're like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, come on. So I in my hunt for like a book about mastering, I only ever found, I think one or two.
Bobcat's book.
Well, the Bobcat. I was just going to say the Bobcats, and then
same thing happened to me a decade ago. So,
it was nearly a decade ago for me as well. So
it was nearly a decade. Yeah, it was like 8 years ago. Yeah,
we were doing this thing at the exact same time, my brother. That's what was happening. But so imagine like. I don't know if it's the Bobcats book because it runs together with this other book, but I remember that the most informative mastering book, other than either it's the appendix of the Bobcats book or it's some other book where the part about the technical part about mastering was quite limited, but then there's this large appendix in the back that was just interviews with mastering engineers, like written out in text, like transcriptions, and it was just interviews with them about them just talking about their philosophical, in quotation marks, approach. Air quotes approach to what they do, and I found that so much more informative. Like that, just hearing them talk about their approach in this abstract way somehow was so much more informative than the technical part of that book. And I now that I think more about it, it would almost definitely not be the Bobcats book, because I think the Bobcats book, if I remember correctly, actually is technically useful. But so I don't know if I'm getting two different books confused. But
right, I think he like explains like exactly what dithering is, exactly what normalization is, whatever it is, like those kinds of very boring things that nobody besides audio engineers knows about.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what you need. You need like a straightforward explanation of like what a compressor does, what dithering is. Like you need like a straightforward explanation of those things, and then simply the philosophy of the approach. It's like almost like mastering is an extreme case where almost everything in between those two poles is not very helpful. Like
mastering is a bizarre subject.
Yeah, it really is. You listen to that mastering podcast. Christian put me onto it, and like it's great podcast. But sometimes
the attack and release show.
Yeah, but then there are some.
Sure, I had those guys on my show.
They're awesome, and send them my love. Yeah. I think they're wonderful. But,
totally.
I think that there are moments, because I'm just I don't know I can't hear all these subtle things that my Christian can hear. That's why I have Christian. But
right,
like you hear them talking about. There's one episode where they talk about using limiters, different limiters as like for EQ moves, and I'm just like come on, like I believe them. I'm not saying I don't believe it, but there's no way in hell I can hear that. Especially in my circumstances, just moving around, like mixing in different environments, and so it's like that is just so specialized. It's amazing. I admire it very much, but it's just a funny, But again, their podcast is brilliant because you're hearing about their approach, the philosophical meta kind of angle. And like music production, you're ultimately an architect. You have to have a meta view. You have to have the zoomed out view. And so I struggle to talk about music production without talking about philosophy. Like I really do,
Yeah. No, I think it's great. And I think also like you need those kind of technical things at the very beginning when you're trying to understand what an EQ does, what a compressor does. But once you kind of understand what it's about, then it's much more helpful to kind of see why someone might use it or how they might use it versus like, if you set the ratio to 2-to-1 versus 4-to-1, this is how much, like, who cares? Yeah. Like, what does it sound like? And when am I going to use it? And how am I going to use it?
That goes for every single tool. Like that goes for even the tool of music theory or the tool of synthesis, right? Like, like all of those are the tools in your toolkit. And, the real task, the ultimate task is that you're a designer, right? That's what you're really doing. And you learn about these things so that you have these different, like the architect needs to understand something about engineering, needs to understand something about society and how people will interact with an object in public or so on and so forth. Like aesthetics, all of these things are just the different tools in the toolkit of the Uber producer, the mythical Uber producer that we all aim to be, right?
Yeah. Something that I've been thinking about for my own productions recently is like, if I use the bass or like the way I play an acoustic or an electric guitar, like that informs so much of how a song is going to go in the production. Because at a certain point, like something I've also learned just by interviewing people is like leaning into what I do best. And so for me, if I just pick up a bass, I know something creative is going to happen that's going to help inform a direction of a song. And so rather than trying to like program just a beat and then building off of that, sometimes if I start off with a cool bass line, that will kind of inform all the other harmonic elements that I'll do or stuff. So I'm just realizing that like the tools that I have, like music theory or whatever, these are things that really kind of are the things that I'm able to kind of lean into and kind of start off a production from. And I just need to be like, okay, I don't need to be the best, serum, patch maker. Like I don't even know anything. Like I got Derek Atwater to hook me up with some of that stuff. But like, shout out to Derek. But like bass, that's something I know, and I know how a bass should feel, and that's kind of like very often my impetus, to get something rolling. I don't know. Do you feel the same way?
So for me, like I very much resonate with what you're saying in terms of the way that you input or produce the sound is going to really inform the direction. So like but for me, that is sort of the reason why I am pursuing learning so many different tools, because I know that if I start a composition by programming drums, that will yield a different result than if I start a composition by sitting at a keyboard, which will yield a different result or vibe or direction than if I'm playing a guitar, or will yield a different result than if I go on YouTube and try to find something weird to sample and use that as my starting point, or it will be a totally different direction if I start off with like a single MIDI note that's just being fed into Ableton every bar, and then simply manipulating what happens to that MIDI note before it even hits a synthesizer. That will yield a different type of direction. So I very much what's the word? I co-sign what you're saying about whatever that first the not first, but the thing you start the thing with, right? Whether you're sitting down
spark,
with your bass, the bass, like even though it's all notes, like you can all look at it and analyze it and say that it's the same notes or whatever. Just the fact that I'm going to sit there with the bass or program something versus any type of starting point is going to yield a different direction, and that is kind of what I'm attempting to use as my superpower. Like the nomadic thing, right? Like from the previous conversation on your podcast, where I was telling you people about being in this very spot in Toronto and having instruments, having my keyboard, having guitars, and having a trumpet, having access to all these things, and being really stuck in a particular workflow, right? And not being able to work in any other way other than it just these particular inputs that I'm really used to.
That's true.
And then moving to India forced me to actually have to discard all of that. I had to discard everything that I knew about like my most comfortable ways of producing music and learn new skills, update skills in sampling, learn new skills in sound design and synthesis, upgrade my mixing skills, and my musicianship atrophied because I had no instruments to play for 7 years. But I learned all these new skills, a bunch of new tools in my toolkit, and I'm able to make records that sound way different than they ever could have, but because of all these new skills. Now, after this is where you
have to put in the reps, though. That's the thing. It's like that. Well, and when you're getting paid to do a production, right? Like it's harder to kind of take the time to do the reps.
Well, I do
you have other.
That's what my solo material is about. That's what my solo material, like that's what my beat tape was about. That's what my the follow up beat tape is going to be about. That's what my upcoming release, which is called Maximum Costanza, is going to be about. Each one of these things is a study in.
The title.
It's a great title. I love Seinfeld. Been getting way hard back into Seinfeld hard, especially being back in this part of the world where that type of humor is sort of it's the
resonates.
Yeah, it resonates the most, And
I saw it. It popped up on Netflix recently here in Israel, and I was like, "Oh man, it's like throwing me back to high school." I kind of want to watch some again.
It's wonderful, and we could just do simply an entire podcast on Seinfeld and how it relates to music production, but let's not. But
let's not.
but we'll do that another time. I will gladly let. We could do that separate. If you want to put that up on your Patreon as like some extra.
Hilarious.
Yeah, but
first I would have to get a Patreon, and then
that's right. It's all joking aside. But the Maximum Costanza, this project that I'm working on now, that just came about out of nowhere, is exactly that. It like. The fact that I get to work on a project like the Caution to the Wind that I did with Mali, or the Cognac Net, or any of the projects I've done with artists, those are situations where, as the producer, I'm required to be serious, and I have to actually, not only do I have to be serious, I have to somehow have 1 foot in seriousness and 1 foot in playfulness, 1 foot in chaos and 1 foot in order, and I'm required to deliver something that is like serious in the sense that I can't let the artist down. I can't let the artist or the band down. And it's got to be at a certain level. And it's got to be up to their standards, and probably a little bit better than their standards if I'm really a producer worth of my salt. Each time I have to sort of try and exceed their standards. And sometimes I don't. And when I don't, then that's a bit of a fail. But the solo stuff is the exact opposite of that. It is play, right? And I only ever got to a point in my life where I could do solo music as play rather than with the seriousness that I approach when I'm working with other artists. The only reason that I can do that playfulness is because I have the serious outlet whenever an artist actually asks me to produce something for them, because I am able to really manifest and do the serious task of making a record for them. That is what necessitates